You've heard of taxes. Every society has them. But under the British Empire in India, taxation wasn't just a matter of coin or law. It became a matter of survival, of hunger, of life and death. And in one of the most shocking displays of colonial control the world has never been taught, the British built something almost unbelievable, a hedge. Not a garden fence, not a marker of land, but a monstrous, living barrier that stretched over 2,500 miles across the Indian subcontinent. A hedge designed to trap people, to control them, to block them from salt, the most basic mineral needed for life. This is the story of the Great Hedge of India, one of the strangest and most sinister tools of imperial power that most of the world still doesn't know existed. At the height of British rule in India, salt was not free. It was taxed heavily. For the colonized in India, salt was life. It preserved food in blistering heat, helped the body survive in harsh climates, and formed part of everyday meals. But for the British Empire, salt was profit. By the mid-19th century, the British administration had discovered that controlling salt meant controlling people. So they passed the salt laws, and then they passed the burden onto the colonized. The British East India Company, and later the Raj, imposed a salt tax so severe that even the poorest villagers could barely afford to buy it legally. Yet, along the coasts of India, from the shores of Gujarat to Bengal, salt formed naturally, freely, under the sun. Villagers had harvested it for centuries. But under British rule, collecting your own salt became a crime. To enforce this unnatural law, the British needed more than courts. They needed a barrier. They needed to stop the salt before it reached the people. And so, they built something extraordinary, something brutal, something absurd. They built a hedge. Not a symbolic hedge, not a short fence. This was a physical wall of thorns, branches, and carefully arranged brushwood. In some areas, it reached 12 feet high and 14 feet thick. It tore across forests, rivers, deserts, and villages. Its purpose was simple: to prevent salt smugglers from bringing untaxed salt into British-controlled regions. But its consequences were far from simple. Imagine a living wall stretching further than the distance from London to Moscow, patrolled daily by British officers and Indian collaborators, designed to stop a mother from feeding her child salt she had gathered herself. Imagine being told you must pay for what your ancestors once harvested freely, or face prison, beatings, or worse. The Great Hedge of India was colonial arrogance made real. A hedge to trap the desperate. Tens of thousands of men were employed to maintain it. Patrol routes were established. Border crossings were erected in the middle of rural farmland. Watchtowers rose above the brush in some parts. Officers rode on horseback, demanding papers, stopping carts, searching sacks of grain for hidden salt. The hedge became a symbol of fear, and for many, of resistance. Villagers cut through it under cover of night. Children were used as scouts. Entire families mapped safer paths through marshes and creeks to smuggle salt past the line. Some stories tell of women hiding salt in their hair, or sewn into the hems of their saris, slipping past patrols with only courage and hunger as companions. Others tell of quiet betrayals, informants among the colonized who sold secrets to the British in exchange for salt rations or protection. The hedge didn't care. It grew and moved with the orders of the empire. New sections were planted. Others were uprooted. Where the terrain became impassable, the hedge was reinforced with stone and fences. Through deserts, the hedge stood like a skeleton of colonial greed, thin, dry, but cutting all the same. Through jungles, it became a tangled wall, a trap for animals and humans alike. And all of this for salt. The absurdity of it is almost too much to believe. A 2,500-mile hedge, longer than the Great Wall of China, built not to protect the people, but to punish them. Built not to mark a border between nations, but a border between freedom and empire. While the British public back home wrote poetry and drank tea, across India, Villagers stared at a wall of thorns that told them they did not own the land they stood on, nor the salt of the earth beneath their feet. No major history book taught this. No school in Britain whispered its name. The Great Hedge of India disappeared from memory as quietly as it had been grown. The documents, the orders, the blueprints, buried in colonial archives. Some files labeled Salt Department, others hidden beneath maps of revenue divisions. The hedge was real, but it was meant to be forgotten. Only in recent decades did historians begin to uncover fragments of the story. A few obscure references in British records. A retired civil servant who once sketched a map. Locals who still remember where the land was cut in two. And one British historian, Roy Moxham, who traced the path of the hedge on foot and found its legacy buried beneath fields, swallowed by time, but never truly gone. Because the land remembers, the salt remembers, and the people remember. The Great Hedge of India is not just a forgotten footnote. It's a symbol of the empire's obsession with control over land, over movement, over breath. It stands as proof that violence does not always come with bullets. Sometimes it comes with branches, with borders, with laws written in ink that bleed into every part of life. It shows how far the British Empire would go to squeeze profit from the poor, to turn survival into a taxable commodity. And still, the colonized resisted. In small ways, quiet ways, brave ways, with smuggled salt, with broken branches, with footsteps in the dark. This is not just the story of a hedge. It's the story of how empire builds walls, not just to keep people out, but to keep them under, to trap not only bodies, but choices, and how the colonized, even behind thorns and watchtowers, found ways to say no. The Great Hedge of India is proof that history still hides its strangest truths, that cruelty doesn't always wear a uniform, and that resistance, even in silence, always finds a way. And this is only the beginning. Because for every hedge built, there are 100 more stories buried beneath it, stories of hunger, of rebellion, of survival. And if this shocked you, if you never imagined empire could grow a wall of thorns to tax a grain of salt, then subscribe, because the untold stories of colonial history are stranger than fiction. And we've only just begun. The hedge may have faded from the land, but it never truly disappeared. Long after the British packed up their records and ships, traces of the Great Hedge of India remained, not just in the soil, but in the memory of those who had lived beside it. In some villages, elders still point to thorny brush growing unnaturally in straight lines and say, "This is where the British made us pay to survive." In others, stories are told in hushed voices about the children who were caught smuggling, about the men who vanished after being seen near patrol routes, about women who slipped through the barrier like ghosts, their sandals filled with salt. The hedge left more than a physical mark. It carved out a psychological border between the colonized and the land that once belonged to them. Imagine growing up in a village split in two by an invisible law, where one side of the path led to your neighbor's field, but crossing it meant breaking an imperial decree. A place where children learned, not from books, but from experience, that the land no longer belonged to them. That even the air, the rain, the salt of the sea could be taxed, patrolled, punished. And the British, they knew the hedge worked. Not perfectly, not completely. Salt smugglers still crossed. Bribes were taken. Passages were cleared in the dead of night. But the hedge had served its purpose. It instilled fear. It created dependence. It made the colonized think twice before reaching for what had once been theirs by birthright. That is the true success of empire. Not just the enforcement of power, but the internalization of it. It's easy to think of colonialism in terms of palaces, flags, battles, and treaties. But the Great Hedge of India forces us to see the quiet violence of empire. The kind that grows slowly, leaf by leaf, law by law, until suddenly, a mother can't feed her child without crossing a line she didn't draw. A line she didn't ask for. a line that punishes her for being alive on the wrong side of history. That is the cruelty of the hedge. It was made to be invisible to those who didn't suffer under it. In London, no schoolchild was taught about it. No politician debated it. No poem was written about the mothers punished for carrying salt. To the colonizers, it was just another line on a map. But for the colonized, it was a cage. A reminder that even the most basic human need could be stolen, fenced in, and sold back at a price they couldn't afford. And today, what's left? Very little. A few patches of thorny scrub, overgrown and ignored. A few maps and dusty archives. A few pages in rare books. And yet, it was once larger than the Berlin Wall. Longer than the Roman Empire's greatest roads. And still, most of the world has never heard of it. That's not an accident. The hedge was designed to be forgotten. Because remembering it would mean facing the absurdity of it. The shame of it. The reality that an empire so obsessed with profit would build a wall of thorns to control salt. To control life. But memory resists. And every time the story of the Great Hedge of India is told, the thorns grow back, not in the soil, but in the minds of those willing to see the empire for what it truly was. Not a civilizing mission, not a partnership, but a system so cruel it planted a forest of pain to protect its own power. The hedge is gone, yes, but the blueprint remains. In borders drawn by foreign hands. In laws that criminalize survival. In systems that punish the poor for needing what the rich control. The Great Hedge of India may be history, but its spirit lives on in every invisible line that says, you can't pass. You don't belong. You must pay. And that is why stories like this matter. Because the past is not past. It echoes. And there are still voices to be heard. Letters to be read. Salt to be reclaimed. This was the story of the hedge. But behind the hedge, there are still hundreds of stories buried. Forgotten uprisings. Criminalized customs. Sacred lands turned into colonial property. People who disappeared when they stepped too close to the wrong fence. So if this shook you, if you found yourself asking, why didn't I know this? Then subscribe. Because the hidden histories of colonialism are not just shocking, they're necessary. Necessary to understanding how the world was shaped. Necessary to honoring those who resisted with nothing but courage. Necessary to making sure that what was erased is written again, not in the margins, but in bold. This was the Great Hedge of India, and we've only scratched the surface. In the decades that followed independence, the hedge all but vanished from memory. Not because it wasn't real, but because it was designed to be forgotten. Unlike monuments and forts and treaties, the Great Hedge of India didn't leave behind stone or steel. It left behind confusion, rumors, shame, and an uneasy silence. Post-colonial governments had more urgent things to deal with, rebuilding nations, feeding their people, reclaiming their land. A hedge? A thorn wall built for salt? It sounded too absurd, too shameful, to be worth the ink. And so, the story faded from textbooks, from museums, from classrooms. But the land didn't forget, and neither did the archives. In the 1990s, a British conservator named Roy Moxham stumbled across a passing reference in an old colonial file, a customs hedge somewhere in northern India. Curious, he began digging. What he uncovered stunned him. Reports, measurements, salary records for officers, botanical notes, maps showing the exact routes where the hedge once stood. It wasn't folklore. It was real. And that's where this story takes another turn. Because the very act of rediscovering the hedge reveals how colonial history works. Not only in domination, but in deletion. Not only in what is done, but in what is buried. The Great Hedge of India was not lost by accident. It was erased, piece by piece, from the official story of empire. Because it didn't look noble. It didn't sound civilized. It sounded like what it was, a giant thorn wall to force starving people to buy salt. But you can't hide thorns forever. Even cut back, they grow. Today, historians, educators, and activists are working to recover these erased stories. not to rewrite history, but to complete it. Because without the story of the hedge, the story of empire is incomplete. It's polished, sanitized, safe. With the hedge, the picture becomes clear. The empire was not just trade and railways. It was surveillance, extraction, dehumanization disguised as policy. And it wasn't just India. Similar systems of control existed across the colonized world, from cocoa controls in West Africa to past laws in South Africa, to the hut tax in Sierra Leone. The hedge was unique in form, but not in function. It was part of a pattern, a global strategy of fencing in the colonized and fencing out their rights. Even now, when you look at satellite images of certain regions in Uttar Pradesh or Madhya Pradesh, you can see odd divisions in tree growth, strange patterns in vegetation that align too perfectly with old British maps. The skeleton of the hedge is still there, just hidden under the surface, like the history itself. And perhaps that's what makes the Great Hedge of India more than just a colonial curiosity. It's a mirror. It forces us to ask, what else have we not been told? What else lies just beneath the surface of the stories we were taught? What else was grown, enforced, and forgotten? Because the hedge isn't just a forgotten wall. It's a warning that what seems too strange to be true is sometimes the most true. That empire doesn't always wear red coats and carry muskets. Sometimes it wears a white shirt, carries a clipboard, and plants a hedge in the name of tax enforcement. And it's not enough to just be shocked. We must remember. We must look again at the maps, at the archives, at the stories passed down in whispers. We must ask our elders, dig into the local names, follow the thorny paths that history tried to prune away. Because every hedge has roots, and some go far deeper than we think. This story, the story of the Great Hedge of India, is one root. But there are others, other fences, other policies, other names, other buried truths still waiting to be uncovered. And that's where we'll go next. Because the untold stories of colonial history don't end with the hedge. They begin there. So if you re-still with us, if this shook something in you, don't let this be where your curiosity ends. Subscribe. Share this story. Talk about it. Challenge what you were taught. Because if the empire went this far to control salt, imagine what it did for gold, for land, for freedom. This was the Great Hedge of India. But beyond the hedge, that's where the real story begins. Beyond the hedge lay more than just land. It held the lives that empire tried to divide. It held the fields where farmers could no longer cross to plant without permission. It held the salt pans where families once labored freely, now policed by armed patrols and crisscrossed with bribes, suspicion, and silence. It held generations born into a reality where their own landscape had become a trap. And perhaps the most haunting truth is this: the hedge worked. Not because it was impenetrable, villagers still slipped through. Salt still moved. Resistance still burned. But the hedge worked because it taught the colonized that their movement could be watched, that their survival could be priced, that even the most basic element of life could be turned into a weapon of the state. And what does it say about the nature of empire? That it could build something this large, this expensive, this absurd, not to protect life, but to choke it. British records speak in the language of bureaucracy, revenue enforcement, customs line, botanical maintenance. But none of those words describe the look on a child's face when her mother is fined for having a pinch of homemade salt. None of them describe the hours a farmer spent staring at the thorns between his home and his family's ancestral well. None of them speak to the shame, the frustration, the quiet violence of being policed by a plant. Because this hedge was not just thorns. It was power disguised as nature. It was law disguised as brush. It was the colonizer's fantasy of order, growing, stretching, tightening, right through the heart of the land. And if it sounds surreal, it's because it was. Empire is surreal. Empire doesn't play by logic. It rewrites logic. The hedge is proof that colonialism wasn't just a set of bad policies or a violent occupation. It was an entire worldview, one where the colonized were not people, but numbers on a revenue chart, obstacles in the path of profit. In that worldview, a man paying twice his wages for salt makes sense. A wall of thorns through villages makes sense. Breaking families to maintain a tax code, it all made sense. But to the people who lived under it, none of it made sense. It just hurt. And they remembered. They remembered the smell of the hedge, dry, bitter, hot. They remembered the men who walked its line with rifles, stopping them like criminals. They remembered the way their grandparents talked about salt, not as a seasoning, but as a secret, a risk, a rebellion. Some remember smuggling it under grain. Others, mixing it with sand to fool inspectors. Still others, paying for it with the last coin they had. But most of all, they remember that the hedge was always there, watching. A silent wall that said, "This is no longer yours." And that is why the story matters. Because the hedge may be gone from the land, but the idea of it, the idea that survival can be restricted, that basic needs can be fenced off by policy and patrolled by violence, that idea is still alive. It's alive in how borders are drawn, in how resources are priced, in how power still works in too many parts of the world. The Great Hedge of India is not a metaphor. It was real. It was 2,500 miles of living, breathing proof that colonialism went to unnatural lengths to enforce unnatural laws. It wasn't enough for the British to take India as salt. They had to make sure no one else could reach it either. And that's why we have to talk about it. Because history that isn't remembered gets repeated. And stories that aren't told get buried. Until they rediscovered in some old file, dismissed as impossible. Until someone decides to ask, what if it wasn't? This was that story. A hedge that should never have existed, but did. And it leaves us with one last question. If empire built a wall of thorns to control salt, what else was it willing to build to control everything else? The answers are still out there. They're in old maps, faded journals, oral histories passed down in villages the textbooks skipped. They're in the stories of forced famines, criminalized traditions, erased resistances. They're in the silence. And we'll follow them. Because there are more stories to tell. This was only one. So if this opened your eyes, if you felt anger, disbelief, curiosity, or just a sense that you should have been taught this, don't let it end here. Like, share, subscribe. Because this is just one thorn pulled from the roots of colonial history. And the next one? That one might be even sharper. And if you've made it this far, if you're still watching, still thinking, still holding on to this story of a forgotten hedge built to trap the colonized, then you already understand what this channel is about. This isn't just about strange facts from history. This is about what was taken, not just in land and labor, but in memory. This is about what was hidden, not just in archives, but in classrooms, in documentaries, in school books, in the spaces where truth was supposed to live. Because history, when told by the powerful, is always incomplete. And the history most of us were taught, it was cleaned, edited, framed to protect the legacy of empire. But what about the stories that make empire uncomfortable? The stories that weren't meant to be remembered? Stories like this one, about a 2,500-mile hedge built to stop poor families from gathering salt. Stories about how policy became punishment, how survival became rebellion, how silence became resistance. This is the heart of this channel. To make visible what was buried, to name what was erased, to remember what was deliberately forgotten. So if this video opened your eyes, even a little, then you need to stay. Because this is not a one-time story. This is part of a larger truth. The British Empire didn't just build the Great Hedge. It built prisons for thought in South Africa. It criminalized language in Nigeria. It taxed water in Kenya. It stole children in Australia. It rewrote maps, renamed cities, redrew borders, and redacted truth, all while calling it civilization. And that's what I uncover here. Every story I post, every documentary, every short, every breakdown, brings you closer to understanding the full picture. Not the one printed in textbooks, the one etched in pain, survival, courage, and resistance. Because these aren't just stories from the past. These are the roots of the present. When we talk about exploitation today, when we talk about inequality, about identity, about borders, about culture, we are still walking through the shadows of these stories. We are still living in a world shaped by those who drew lines like hedges and said, "This is ours now." So if you want to understand the world, truly understand it, you have to understand empire. And to understand empire, you have to start listening to the stories empire tried to silence. That's what I'm here to do. So don't just watch this and move on. Like this video if it challenged you. Share it with someone who was never taught this in school. Comment below. Tell me what shocked you. What made you angry? What made you curious? Let's talk. Let's build knowledge in public. Together. And most importantly, subscribe. Because this channel is your home for the real history. The hard history. The hidden history. If this story shook you, wait until you hear what happened in East Africa when the colonizers taxed birth itself. Or how entire languages were erased, then stolen. Or how silence became the most dangerous weapon in a colony where rebellion wasn't shouted, it was written. You're here now, and that means you're already part of this. Because remembering is resistance. And together, we're just getting started.